Hey, Miss Schroeder here, and this is a lesson that's going to talk about Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy might be something that you've heard of before. It's basically a term for different levels of questioning and thinking. We're going to adapt them a little bit for our purposes in this unit, but basically what we're going to be doing in this unit is as we are reading a book, we're going to develop different types of questions about that text. And so there's going to be 6 different levels of questions, and you're going to be responsible for creating all different types of questions according to Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is, and you'll see that you'll have access to a triangle that shows the different level of blooms. And the idea is that there are knowledge questions and comprehension questions right at the bottom of the triangle, because they're kind of the foundation, right? Like you need to be able to ask and answer these types of questions in order to go higher into this pyramid. So it's not like that one question is more important than another. The higher in the pyramid is supposed to be more like thought process, more thinking, more inferences that need to be made. But you definitely need all different types of questions to have a true, well-rounded understanding of whatever concept you are creating around Bloom's taxonomy. So we're going to start at the bottom of the triangle because these are the foundation questions. These are called knowledge questions. Knowledge questions are often called right there questions because you don't have to do any thinking whatsoever. You simply can see the answer in the text, right? Like you can point to it. So it would say like, Bobby is sitting in a chair. And then the question would be, who is sitting in the chair, right? And I could just point to the answer. There's no thinking required. So usually these types of questions are just making sure like, did you read the text? Do you recall this information? Sort of questions. Comprehension questions are very similar to that. But comprehension questions require you to do some thinking, right? I could answer a knowledge question and have zero understanding of what I just read, right? Like I could see in the question it says like, how old is Jessica? I could not know what that means, but it could say in the text, Jessica is 20 years old, right? And I could point to the answer. Comprehension questions, though, do require me to understand the text a little bit. I can't just point to the answer. Comprehension questions are probably the most popular type of question that you've been exposed to, especially in classes where you take a lot of tests, because comprehension questions basically are asking, do you understand it? Or did you read the book? So questions like, what happened in chapter 2, right? Nowhere in the story is it going to say, here's what happened in chapter 2, right? I would have to have read it, understood it, and then put it in my own words. So unless like you can point to the exact answer to the question, like if I could take something from a book and plop it into the answer without changing it, it is a knowledge question. But if I have to change it to directly answer the question, then it becomes comprehension. So comparing two characters in the story, explaining why I think a character did something when it's pretty obvious why they did it, those sorts of things would all be comprehension questions. And usually if you're like, well, I'm not sure if that's comprehension or knowledge, honestly, it's usually going to be comprehension. Most questions that somebody asks you, especially if they're longer than a couple of words, are going to require you to change the wording or make a little bit of inferences, making them comprehension questions. The next type of question is an application question. Application question is when you connect whatever the concept is, in our case, it's usually a book, to the real world or to yourself. So in this case, if you're reading a book, you'd answer questions like, have you ever felt like so-and-so did in the book, right? Because that would be connecting it to you. Or you could say, if you were in the book, right? If this was in your situation, what would you do? Or you could say, name one person that this character reminds you of, or name something that happens in our society today that also happens in the book. Anytime that you are putting together the book with our real world or yourself, it is an application question. The next type of question is an analysis question. And these can be kind of tricky, so I have some helpful hints for you. Analysis questions are when you take outside knowledge and you apply it to the new concept. So it's something that not only do you have to understand the story or the concept, right? Because these questions can be made for more than just books, but you also have to understand something else, and then you put it together. For our purposes, I'm going to make it easier for you, and I'm going to say use a literary element and come up with an analysis question, right? Because that would fit. Because if I were to say, like, name a conflict that happens in the story, I'd have to understand the story, but I'd also have to understand what conflict is and then put those two ideas together. And so anytime, take all those literary elements that we reviewed in trimester 1 and in 2, like, and in previous classes, right, you've talked about literary elements, conflict, character motivation, indirect characterization, setting, right, all those different long lists, metaphors of literary elements, and just ask where one of those are, or take a passage from the story and say, hey, here's the passage, what literary element do you see? And all of that would be an example of an analysis question. The next type of question is a synthesis question. A synthesis question becomes a little bit more difficult because this is finally where you get to put your voice into your reflection of the story or the concept. Because in a synthesis question, you have to know and understand the story or the concept so well that you're able to analyze how changes to it would affect it, or create your own changes to it, and really play around with the concept or the story. So for this one, you have to say, like, hey, imagine that this character never existed. How would the story be different? And in order to answer that, right, if it's a good synthesis question, you can't just say, oh, well, the character wouldn't be there. You'd have to really understand the character's purpose and really be able to say, how did they affect the story? What would happen? And that takes a deep understanding of the story, right? So for a synthesis question, it's adding something, taking something away, and then analyzing the impact of that. And when you're answering it, you really want to be able to show that you do have a deep understanding of the story, of that part of the story, and how that change really impacted it. The last type of question is an evaluation question. Evaluation questions are supposed to be the hardest, and sometimes students think that they're the easiest. And what I mean by the hardest, I mean that they require the most understanding of the story or the concept. And if you're not using a great understanding of the story or concept, then you're not doing these higher level questions correct, right? If you can answer a synthesis question without really understanding the story, you probably don't have a great synthesis question. If you can answer an evaluation question without showing a deep understanding of the story, you probably don't have a great evaluation question. In fact, to answer a great evaluation question usually will take like more than a paragraph. Like it'll be like 5 to 10 sentences in length if it's a really good evaluation question. Evaluation questions usually have two parts. So they're opinion questions, right? So there's no right or wrong answer to an evaluation question, but you need to provide enough evidence to support your opinion. So I've kind of given you a sentence frame that you can use for all evaluation questions. And what you could say is you could say, what makes a good blank, right? So you could say, what makes a good friend? What makes a good teacher? What makes a good story? What makes a good person? Like whatever, what makes a good blank? And then apply that to the story, right? So what makes a good friend? Which character in the story do you think is the best friend and why? Or what makes a good mom? Do you think such and such mom from the story is a good mom? Then to answer that would take a really long time, right? So I'd have to say, well, a good friend is kind, understanding, and helpful. But then I'd also have to give you specific evidence from the story to prove that my character has those three things, right? So it would take a really long time to really be able to prove or substantiate whatever opinion I give. And that's what makes a good evaluation question. So we're going to practice a lot, not only creating evaluation questions, but also answering them, because it really takes some deep inferences and understanding of the story to answer them. So that's kind of our first exposure to these different types of questions. We are going to continue to practice with this and master not only creating them, but also answering them.